The silence that fell over the Duke of Ravenscar's grand dining hall was not the comfortable quiet of satisfaction after a fine meal, but the suffocating hush of collective shock, the kind that makes even the most seasoned members of London's high society forget to breathe. Eleanor Ashford felt the familiar burn of humiliation spread across her cheeks like wildfire as her husband's hand came down hard on the mahogany table, the sharp crack of his palm against polished wood punctuating his command that she cease speaking immediately, that she remember her place, that women of breeding did not dare contradict their husbands on matters of politics and estate management before distinguished company. The words he had just spoken, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had perfected the art of diminishing his wife in public spaces, hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor felt herself shrinking, retreating into that small, dark place inside herself where she had learned to hide over the 3 endless years of her marriage to Geoffrey Ashford, a man whose mediocre position in society was matched only by his extraordinary capacity for cruelty. What Eleanor did not see in that moment, as she lowered her eyes to her untouched dessert and willed herself to become invisible, was the expression that crossed the face of Alexander Thornfield, the Duke of Ravenscar, seated at the head of his own table like a dark angel of judgment. The other guests saw it, though, and those who knew the Duke well felt their blood run cold, for they recognized that particular quality of stillness that came over him when his legendary temper was stirring beneath the surface of his infamous self-control. The Duke's grey eyes, which moments before had been observing the dinner conversation with polite disinterest, had sharpened into something that resembled steel in winter moonlight, fixed upon Geoffrey Ashford with an intensity that would have made wiser men reconsider their life choices. Alexander Thornfield had not become one of the most powerful and feared men in England by tolerating the abuse of those weaker than himself, and watching Geoffrey Ashford silence his wife with such casual brutality had ignited something in the Duke's chest that he had thought long dead, a protective fury he had not felt since the day he discovered his own mother, broken and silent, after years of his father's emotional cruelty. "I'm so happy you are here with me today, sharing this journey into a world where power and privilege often mask the deepest cruelties, but where sometimes, just sometimes, justice wore the face of an unlikely champion. If this story speaks to your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like, because your support allows me to continue bringing you these tales of courage, vindication, and the kind of love that changes everything." Eleanor had learned, in the years since her family's financial ruin had forced her into marriage with Geoffrey Ashford, that survival required the death of hope, the systematic dismantling of every dream she had once harbored about love, partnership, and respect. Her father, desperate to save the Ashford name from complete social annihilation after a series of disastrous investments, had arranged the match with Geoffrey, a man of sufficient income and social ambition who saw in Eleanor's beauty and breeding an opportunity to elevate his own standing. What her father had not known, what he could not have known in the brief courtship period that propriety allowed, was that Geoffrey Ashford was a man who viewed his wife not as a partner, but as property, not as a companion, but as an object to be controlled, silenced, and shaped according to his will, to his. The marriage had begun its descent into nightmare on their wedding night, when Eleanor, full of naive hope and determination to make the best of her circumstances, had offered an opinion about the arrangement of their new household, and Geoffrey had looked at her with an expression of such cold contempt that she felt it like a physical blow. He had informed her then, in tones that suggested he was explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child, that her thoughts, her feelings, and her voice were irrelevant in their marriage, that she existed solely to bear his name, manage his household according to his specifications, and present a pleasing appearance in society while keeping her opinions locked behind her teeth. Over the months and years that followed, Geoffrey had perfected the art of humiliating her in social settings, always careful to do so in ways that stopped just short of creating a scandal, always managing to make it seem as though he was simply correcting an overstepping wife, rather than systematically destroying her spirit. Tonight's dinner at Ravenscar House was meant to be Geoffrey's crowning achievement, his entry into the innermost circles of power and influence. For an invitation to dine privately with the Duke of Ravenscar was a prize that men schemed for years to obtain. Geoffrey had spent weeks preparing Eleanor for this evening, drilling into her the absolute necessity of silence, of perfection, of becoming nothing more than a beautiful ornament that reflected well upon him. But Eleanor, in a moment of weakness, in a brief rebellion against the prison of her own life, had allowed herself to speak when the Duke asked her opinion directly about a charity initiative for London's orphans, and her thoughtful, intelligent response had been met with Geoffrey's fury and his demand that she remember her place. What neither Eleanor nor Geoffrey understood in that crystallizing moment was that the Duke of Ravenscar had just made a decision that would shatter the carefully constructed walls of Eleanor's prison and transform both their lives forever. The arrangement that had brought Eleanor to her marriage with Geoffrey Ashford had its roots in tragedy, in the kind of financial catastrophe that could reduce a respectable family to desperation within a single season. Eleanor's father, Richard Hartley, had been a gentleman of modest but comfortable means, a man respected in his county for his integrity and kindness, who had raised his only daughter with love, education, and the expectation that she would marry well, not for fortune but for affection and mutual respect. Eleanor had grown up in a household where her opinions were valued, where her father encouraged her to read widely and think deeply, where her mother had modelled quiet strength and intelligence, and she had entered her first London season at 18, with the kind of hopeful confidence that comes from being genuinely loved and respected within one's own home. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans, and those plans manifested in the form of a business partner's betrayal and a series of investments that collapsed like dominoes, leaving Richard Hartley not only penniless, but deeply in debt. The shame of it had nearly killed him. This gentle man who had never imagined he would be unable to provide for his daughter's future, and when Geoffrey Ashford had presented himself as a solution, offering to marry Eleanor and assume her father's debts in exchange for the social elevation that came with marrying into an old and respected family, Richard had seen no other option. Eleanor, watching her father age a decade in a matter of months, had agreed to the marriage without hesitation, sacrificing herself on the altar of filial duty with the kind of resigned grace that would become her defining characteristic in the years to come. Geoffrey Ashford had seemed in those brief weeks of courtship to be a reasonable match, if not an inspiring one. He was 32 to her 19, a man of business rather than breeding, who had made his fortune through shipping investments and commercial ventures that the true aristocracy looked down upon but could not entirely dismiss. He was pleasant enough in company, attentive in the prescribed ways, and Eleanor had convinced herself that respect and partnership could grow between them even without the romantic love she had once dreamed of. What she had not seen, what Geoffrey had taken great care to conceal during their chaperoned meetings, was the seething resentment he carried toward the world that had denied him entry based on the circumstances of his birth, the cold ambition that drove him to view his marriage not as a partnership, but as a transaction, and the cruel need for control that would reveal itself only once Eleanor was legally and irrevocably his property. The wedding had taken place in Eleanor's parish church, a small and quiet affair befitting a family in reduced circumstances, and Eleanor had walked down the aisle in her mother's altered wedding gown, carrying white roses and a heart full of determined hope that she could make this work, that she could be happy or at least content in the life that duty had chosen for her. Her father had wept as he placed her hand in Geoffrey's, though Eleanor had assumed his tears were simply the natural emotion of a father giving away his daughter, not realizing until much later that Richard Hartley had sensed something fundamentally wrong in the man he was entrusting with his child's happiness, and hated himself for having no other choice. The transformation in Geoffrey after the wedding had been swift and absolute, as though he had been wearing a mask during their courtship that he no longer had any need to maintain. Within days of their marriage, Eleanor discovered that her husband viewed her not as a partner, but as a possession, not as a person with thoughts and feelings worthy of consideration, but as an object whose sole purpose was to elevate his social standing, manage his household to his exacting specifications, and eventually produce heirs who would cement his position in society. Any attempt Eleanor made to express an opinion, to suggest an alternative approach, or simply to engage in the kind of intellectual conversation she had enjoyed with her father, was met with Geoffrey's icy contempt and his increasingly public demonstrations of her irrelevance. The 3 years that followed Eleanor's wedding were a masterclass in the systematic destruction of a human spirit, a slow and deliberate process by which Jeffrey Ashford transformed his intelligent, hopeful young wife into a silent shadow who had learned that survival meant the complete suppression of self. At home, behind the closed doors of their fashionable London townhouse, Jeffrey's cruelty took the form of cold indifference punctuated by sudden rages when Eleanor failed to anticipate his needs or manage the household staff according to his impossible standards. He criticized everything from the way she arranged flowers in the drawing room to the tone of voice she used when greeting his business associates, always making it clear that she was a disappointment, a burden he had taken on out of misguided charity, and that her only hope of earning even basic civility was to become exactly what he demanded: invisible, silent, and perfectly obedient. But it was in public settings that Jeffrey's cruelty became truly refined, for he had discovered that nothing gave him quite the same satisfaction as humiliating Eleanor in front of others, demonstrating his control over her while simultaneously positioning himself as a patient husband, dealing with an intellectually inferior wife. He developed a particular talent for waiting until Eleanor was engaged in conversation with other ladies, perhaps discussing a book she had read or expressing sympathy for some charitable cause, and then interrupting with a comment that simultaneously silenced her and painted her as foolish or over-emotional. The other ladies would offer Eleanor sympathetic glances but say nothing, for it was not proper to interfere between husband and wife, and Eleanor learned to stop speaking altogether in social settings, to smile politely and nod and contribute nothing, becoming the kind of decorative nullity that Jeffrey seemed to prefer. The isolation was perhaps the worst part, for Jeffrey had systematically cut Eleanor off from every source of comfort and strength she had once known. Her father had died 6 months after her wedding, his heart giving out under the combined weight of financial ruin and guilt over his daughter's fate, and her mother had followed him within the year, leaving Eleanor truly alone in the world with no family to turn to and no resources of her own. Jeffrey controlled every aspect of their finances, doling out household money with meticulous calculation and making it clear that Eleanor had no claim to anything beyond what he chose to give her. He monitored her correspondence, discouraged friendships with other ladies that he deemed unsuitable or too influential, and created a life for Eleanor that revolved entirely around his needs, his schedule, and his social ambitions. Yet despite everything Jeffrey had done to break her, despite the years of systematic cruelty and deliberate humiliation, Eleanor had managed to preserve some small core of herself deep inside, a tiny flame of who she had been before her marriage that refused to be completely extinguished. She nurtured this secret self through books borrowed from lending libraries when Jeffrey was occupied with business, through quiet moments in the garden where she could remember her mother's voice and her father's gentle encouragement, and through the charitable work she was permitted to do as long as it reflected well on Jeffrey's reputation. It was this hidden strength, this refusal to completely surrender even when surrender seemed like the only path to peace, that had caused Eleanor to answer when the Duke of Ravenscar addressed her directly at dinner, that had made her forget Jeffrey's warnings for one dangerous moment and speak with the intelligence and compassion that were her true nature. The Duke of Ravenscar had noticed Eleanor Ashford before that fateful dinner, though she did not know it, for Alexander Thornfield made it his business to observe the people who moved through London's high society, particularly those who seemed out of place or uncomfortable in their own lives. He had seen her at various social functions over the past year, this beautiful woman who never spoke, who seemed to shrink into herself whenever her husband was near, whose eyes held a sadness that reminded him painfully of his own mother in the years before her death. Alexander had learned to recognize the signs of a marriage built on control and cruelty, for he had witnessed firsthand what such a union could do to a gentle soul, and something about Eleanor Ashford's quiet suffering had caught his attention in a way that troubled him, stirring memories and protective instincts he had thought long buried beneath the ice of his own grief and isolation. Alexander Thornfield had extended the dinner invitation to Jeffrey Ashford, not out of any desire for the man's company, but rather as part of a deliberate investigation into the rumors that had reached his ears through his network of servants and society contacts. The Duke had learned long ago that the truth of what happened in London's marriages could rarely be found in ballrooms and drawing rooms, where everyone wore their finest masks, but rather in the whispered conversations of ladies' maids and footmen, in the observations of sharp-eyed housekeepers who saw the bruises that cosmetics tried to hide and heard the tears that silk pillows tried to muffle. His own housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, a woman who had served his family for 30 years and had held him when he wept after his mother's death, had mentioned Eleanor Ashford with particular concern, having heard from other servants that the young Mrs. Ashford was never seen without her husband's permission, that she crept through her own home like a ghost, and that the staff lived in fear of their master's unpredictable rages. The decision to invite the Ashfords to an intimate dinner, rather than encounter them at a larger social event, had been strategic, for Alexander wanted to observe Geoffrey's behavior in a setting where the man might feel secure enough to reveal his true nature, and he wanted to see how Eleanor responded when addressed directly by someone whose social power far exceeded her husband's ability to control the situation. What Alexander had not anticipated was the visceral rage he would feel when Geoffrey Ashford struck that table and spoke to his wife as though she were a disobedient servant rather than his partner, or the way Eleanor's immediate retreat into silence would pierce through all the careful emotional armor Alexander had constructed over the years since his mother's death. In that moment, watching Eleanor shrink and diminish before his eyes, Alexander saw his mother's face, remembered her quiet acceptance of his father's emotional cruelty, and felt something break open inside his chest that he had kept locked away for far too long. The intervention that followed was not planned or calculated, but rather erupted from Alexander with the force of years of suppressed anger and grief finally finding an outlet. He had risen from his chair with such cold authority that conversation at the table ceased instantly, every eye turning to the Duke, whose reputation for icy control was legendary, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute power and barely contained fury. He informed Geoffrey Ashford that in his house, in any house where civilization and decency still held meaning, a woman's voice was not merely permitted, but valued, that intelligence and compassion were qualities to be celebrated rather than suppressed, and that any man who needed to silence his wife in order to feel powerful was revealing not her weakness, but his own fundamental inadequacy. The words had hung in the air like a pronouncement from on high, and Geoffrey's face had cycled through shock, outrage, and finally fear as he realized he had just been publicly rebuked by one of the most powerful men in England. Alexander had then done something that shocked his guests even more than his rebuke of Geoffrey. He had turned to Eleanor with an expression of genuine respect and interest, and requested that she continue with the thought she had been expressing about the orphan charity, making it clear that her opinion was not only welcome, but specifically sought. Eleanor had looked up at him with eyes full of such surprised gratitude and lingering fear that Alexander felt his heart constrict, and when she had spoken again, her voice trembling but her words intelligent and compassionate, outlining a detailed plan for improving conditions in London's orphanages, Alexander had listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his sincere interest in her ideas. The other guests had watched this exchange with fascinated horror, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a duke of the realm treating a nobody's wife as though her thoughts mattered, as though she were a person worthy of respect rather than merely decorative property. The dinner had concluded in awkward tension, with Geoffrey seething silently, and Eleanor caught between confusion and a dangerous flutter of hope that she tried desperately to suppress, knowing that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. But as the Ashfords prepared to depart, Alexander had done one more thing that sealed their fates. He had informed Geoffrey, in tones that brooked no argument, that he required Mrs. Ashford's assistance with the orphanage project they had discussed, and that he would be sending his carriage for her 3 times weekly so that she might work with his secretary on the implementation details. Geoffrey had been unable to refuse without giving mortal offense to a duke, and so he had agreed through gritted teeth, while Eleanor felt the world tilting on its axis, uncertain whether the Duke of Ravenscar had just saved her life or made it infinitely more dangerous. The weeks that followed the dinner at Ravenscar House became a study in contrasts for Eleanor. Her life split between 2 completely different worlds that seemed to exist in different centuries despite occupying the same city. At home with Geoffrey, The atmosphere had turned glacial and dangerous. For her husband's humiliation at the Duke's hands had ignited a fury that he could not direct at Alexander Thornfield, but could certainly unleash upon his wife. Geoffrey's cruelty, which had always been cold and calculated, took on a new edge of desperation as he sought to reassert control over the one person in his life who could not escape his authority. He interrogated Eleanor about every moment she spent at Ravenscar House, demanded detailed accounts of every conversation, and made it explicitly clear that if she embarrassed him further or gave the Duke any reason to think poorly of their marriage, the consequences would be severe in ways that left no visible marks but destroyed nonetheless. Yet 3 times each week, Alexander's carriage would arrive at the Ashford townhouse, and Eleanor would step into it feeling as though she were crossing from darkness into light, from prison into freedom, from silence into the possibility of having a voice again. Those hours at Ravenscar House, ostensibly spent planning improvements to London's orphanages, became the only time Eleanor could breathe without feeling Geoffrey's control tightening around her throat. Alexander's secretary, Mr. Peters, was a kind older gentleman who treated Eleanor with professional respect, but it was the Duke himself who often joined their planning sessions, offering insights and resources, asking Eleanor's opinion on matters of policy and implementation, and listening to her responses as though they contained genuine value. For a woman who had spent 3 years being told that her thoughts were worthless, this simple act of being heard and respected was more intoxicating than wine and more dangerous than opium. Alexander Thornfield found himself increasingly drawn to these sessions, initially telling himself that he was simply ensuring the orphanage project received proper oversight, but gradually admitting that what drew him to his study 3 afternoons each week was not charitable work but the presence of Eleanor Ashford herself. He discovered in her a keen intelligence that years of suppression had not managed to destroy, a compassion that extended even to those who had hurt her, and a quiet strength that manifested not in loud defiance, but in her simple refusal to let Geoffrey completely erase who she was. Alexander began to understand that Eleanor's silence in society was not evidence of emptiness, but rather proof of survival, a strategy she had adopted to protect the essential core of herself from complete destruction. The more time he spent with her, the more he saw glimpses of the woman she had been before her marriage, and the more he wanted to see that woman fully restored. The turning point in their relationship came on a grey afternoon in late autumn, when Eleanor arrived at Ravenscar House with a bruise barely concealed beneath the powder on her jaw, the result of Geoffrey's rage the previous evening when she had returned home minutes later than expected. Alexander had seen the bruise immediately, despite Eleanor's attempts to hide it, and something in him had simply shattered, all his careful control and emotional distance crumbling in the face of visible evidence of what he had long suspected. He had dismissed Mr. Peters with unusual abruptness, closed the study door, and then had done something completely improper. He had asked Eleanor directly if her husband was hurting her, his voice rough with barely suppressed fury and something that sounded almost like anguish. Eleanor had frozen at the question, every instinct screaming at her to deny it, to protect the facade of her marriage, to remember that speaking truth about one's husband to another man was the kind of scandal that could destroy her completely. But she was so tired, so desperately tired of carrying the weight of Geoffrey's cruelty alone, of pretending that everything was fine when she was slowly dying inside. And something about the way Alexander looked at her in that moment, with an expression that combined rage and tenderness in equal measure, made the walls she had built around her truth simply crumble. She had told him everything then, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam, the systematic humiliation, the isolation, the way Geoffrey wielded silence like a weapon, the way he had taken a hopeful young woman and methodically transformed her into a hollow ghost. And Alexander had listened to every word with an expression of such controlled fury that Eleanor understood, perhaps for the first time, that she was not alone anymore, that someone with the power to help her actually cared whether she lived or died. What happened after Eleanor's confession was something she had never expected, something that changed the fundamental nature of her relationship with Alexander Thornfield and revealed the man behind the Duke's cold facade. Alexander had not offered her empty platitudes or sympathetic words that cost nothing, and changed nothing, but instead had shared with her a story he had never told anyone outside his most trusted inner circle. A story about his own mother and the silent suffering that had defined her marriage to his father. He told Eleanor about Lady Catherine Thornfield, a woman of grace and intelligence who had married the previous Duke at 17 and spent the next 20 years slowly fading away under the weight of her husband's emotional cruelty. A man who never raised his hand to her but destroyed her spirit through constant criticism, public humiliation, and the systematic denial of her worth as a human being. Alexander's voice had been raw with old pain as he described watching his mother transform from a vibrant woman into a silent ghost who moved through Ravenscar House as though she were already dead, and how as a young man he had not understood what was happening, had not recognized the signs of abuse because there were no physical bruises to mark his father's cruelty. He told Eleanor about the day he returned from university to find his mother in her rooms, having taken her own life rather than face another decade of systematic degradation, and about the letter she had left him explaining that she simply had nothing left inside herself to give, that his father had hollowed her out until she was nothing but an empty shell wearing his mother's face. The guilt of not having saved her, of not having understood in time that silence and suffering could be just as deadly as violence, had haunted Alexander for 15 years and had shaped every decision he made as Duke, every cause he championed, and every intervention he made when he witnessed cruelty masquerading as marriage. Eleanor had wept as Alexander shared his story, not just for his mother, but for the young man he had been, powerless to save someone he loved, and for the Duke he had become, carrying that guilt like a stone in his chest. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted between them, a connection forged not in romance or passion, but in the deeper recognition of two souls who understood suffering and survival, who had both been shaped by the cruelty of others and refused to let that cruelty define who they became. Alexander had reached across the distance between them and taken Eleanor's hand, not as a romantic gesture but as a promise, and he had told her in a voice that shook with conviction that he would not stand by and watch another woman be destroyed by a man who confused control with love, that he would use every ounce of his power and influence to free her from Geoffrey Ashford, and that she need never be afraid again as long as he drew breath. The plan Alexander outlined in the days that followed was both audacious and methodical, for he understood that freeing Eleanor from her marriage would require more than simply wanting it to be so. English law in their era gave husbands almost absolute power over their wives, and divorce was scandalous, expensive, and nearly impossible to obtain unless one could prove adultery, cruelty so extreme that it endangered life, or complete desertion. But Alexander Thornfield had not become one of the most powerful men in England by accepting limitations, and he set about building a case against Geoffrey Ashford with the systematic precision of a general planning a military campaign. He hired investigators to document Geoffrey's business dealings, looking for evidence of fraud or illegal activity that could provide leverage, and he quietly reached out to other women in society who might have witnessed Geoffrey's treatment of Eleanor and be willing to provide testimony if needed. More importantly, Alexander began to prepare Eleanor herself for what lay ahead, for he understood that freedom would require her to find her voice again, to reclaim the strength that Geoffrey had spent 3 years trying to destroy. During their meetings, which now extended far beyond the orphanage project, Alexander encouraged Eleanor to speak her mind on every subject, to express opinions without fear of rebuke, to remember that her thoughts and feelings had value regardless of what her husband had told her. He watched as Eleanor slowly began to unfold like a flower that had been kept too long in darkness, her natural intelligence and warmth gradually returning as she learned that not all men would punish her for being herself. And somewhere in the midst of planning her liberation, Alexander realized with a mixture of wonder and terror that he was falling in love with Eleanor Ashford, not as a project to be saved, but as a woman whose strength and grace had captured his heart completely. The weeks of preparation culminated in Alexander making a decision that would shock London society and irrevocably alter the course of both their lives. He would not wait for investigations to bear fruit or for legal mechanisms to slowly grind toward justice, but would instead use the upcoming grand ball of the season, the most important social event of the year, as the stage for Eleanor's public vindication. The ball was to be held at Thornfield Palace, the Duke's ancestral London residence, and it would be attended by every person of consequence in England, from members of the royal family to the most influential peers of the realm. Alexander understood that what he was planning was risky, that it could backfire spectacularly and destroy both their reputations. But he also understood that sometimes justice required bold action, that freedom could not wait for perfect conditions, and that Eleanor deserved to be liberated not quietly and shamefully, but publicly and triumphantly. Alexander's first move was to ensure that Geoffrey Ashford received an invitation to the ball, one that the social climbing merchant could not possibly refuse without admitting that he feared the Duke's scrutiny. The invitation was worded in such a way that Geoffrey would believe his stock was rising in society, that his humiliation at the dinner weeks earlier had been forgotten, and that the Duke was offering him another chance to prove himself worthy of elevated social circles. Geoffrey, whose desperation for acceptance among the aristocracy outweighed his caution, accepted immediately, and spent the following days preparing himself and Eleanor for what he imagined would be his social triumph, never suspecting that Alexander Thornfield had extended the invitation specifically to ensure Geoffrey would witness his own downfall. Eleanor herself was not fully aware of what Alexander planned for the ball, for he had deliberately kept certain details from her, knowing that if she understood the magnitude of what he intended to do, she might try to stop him to protect him from potential scandal. What Eleanor did know was that Alexander had insisted she have a new gown made for the occasion, one befitting a duchess rather than a merchant's wife, and that he had arranged for the modiste to come to Ravenscar House for fittings, ensuring that Geoffrey would have no opportunity to interfere with the creation of a dress that would make Eleanor shine. The gown that emerged from those secret fittings was a masterpiece of silver silk that seemed to capture moonlight, cut in a style that was both modest and stunning, designed to make Eleanor look not like someone trying to rise above her station, but like someone finally dressed appropriately for the station she had always deserved. The evening of the ball arrived with all the weight of destiny, and Eleanor dressed in her silver gown with hands that trembled slightly, though she could not have said whether it was from fear or anticipation. Geoffrey, resplendent in his finest evening clothes and practically vibrating with self-importance, had spent the carriage ride to Thornfield Palace lecturing Eleanor on proper behavior, reminding her that she was to speak only when spoken to agree with everything he said, and to remember that this evening represented his opportunity to finally claim his place among the true elite. Eleanor had nodded obediently, but inside her chest something was stirring, some combination of hope and terror that Alexander's influence over the past weeks had awakened, a sense that tonight would change everything, though she could not yet see how. Thornfield Palace blazed with thousands of candles as their carriage pulled up to the entrance, and Eleanor stepped out into a world of splendor that seemed almost dreamlike in its magnificence. The ballroom was a vision of crystal chandeliers and golden light, filled with the most powerful and influential people in England, all dressed in their finest jewels and silks, all gathered to celebrate the height of the social season in the home of the realm's most eligible and mysterious duke. Geoffrey immediately began working the room, introducing himself to anyone who would listen, and dropping the Duke's name at every opportunity, while Eleanor followed in his wake like a silent shadow, just as she had done at countless other events. But tonight was different, for tonight Eleanor could feel the weight of Alexander's gaze finding her across the crowded ballroom, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart pound with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Tonight, everything would change. The ball proceeded with all the elegant choreography that such events required, with guests moving through elaborate dances, engaging in carefully calibrated conversations, and navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed every interaction in London's highest circles. Eleanor stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the swirl of color and movement with the detached observation of someone who had learned that participation was dangerous, that drawing attention meant inviting Geoffrey's wrath later when they were alone. She had nearly convinced herself that tonight would be like every other social event, another exercise in becoming invisible, when the entire ballroom fell silent as the Duke of Ravenscar himself descended the grand staircase, and the Master of Ceremonies announced that His Grace would be making a special address to his assembled guests. Alexander Thornfield stood at the center of his ballroom with the absolute confidence of a man who had been born to command, his dark evening clothes perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, but his presence so commanding that even the most jaded members of society found themselves holding their breath in anticipation. He began by thanking his guests for honoring him with their presence, speaking in the cultured tones that had been trained into him from birth. But there was an undercurrent of steel in his voice that suggested this would be no ordinary social pleasantry. He spoke of duty and honor, of the responsibilities that came with power and privilege, and of his belief that true nobility was measured not by the accident of one's birth, but by the content of one's character and the treatment one afforded to those with less power than oneself. The speech took a turn that had society matrons exchanging shocked glances when Alexander began to speak about the particular cruelty of marriages built on control rather than partnership, of men who confused dominance with strength and silence with obedience, and of his observation that London society too often turned a blind eye to systematic cruelty simply because it occurred within the sanctified bounds of matrimony. Geoffrey Ashford, standing near the front of the assembled guests, had gone pale as he began to understand that this speech was not abstract philosophy, but pointed accusation, and his hand had moved instinctively toward Eleanor as though to silence her, even though she had not spoken, had not moved, had barely breathed since the Duke began speaking. It was at that precise moment that Alexander's gaze found Eleanor across the crowded ballroom, and he spoke her name for the first time that evening, his voice carrying clearly through the cavernous space as he requested that Mrs. Eleanor Ashford join him at the center of the floor. The assembled guests parted like the Red Sea as Eleanor, moving as though in a dream, walked through the crowd toward the Duke, her silver gown catching the candlelight and making her seem almost ethereal. Geoffrey moved to intercept her, his face contorted with rage and fear. But Alexander's next words stopped him cold. He informed the assembled company that he had evidence of Mr. Ashford's systematic abuse of his wife, evidence that had been corroborated by servants, witnesses, and Eleanor's own testimony, and that he had used his influence with the Crown to have the marriage investigated with the intention of seeking an annulment based on fraud and cruelty. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers and gasps, society's carefully maintained facade of propriety cracking as the Duke of Ravenscar publicly called out behavior that everyone had witnessed, but no one had dared name. Geoffrey began to bluster, to deny, to appeal to the masculine solidarity that usually protected men like him from consequences. But Alexander cut through his protests with surgical precision, listing specific incidents of public humiliation, detailing the testimony of servants who had witnessed Geoffrey's private cruelty, and making it clear that any man who continued to defend Ashford's behavior would find himself on the wrong side of the Duke. As considerable displeasure. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of people, but feeling as though she and Alexander were the only two people in existence, as he systematically dismantled the prison that Geoffrey had built around her life, and offered her freedom in front of all of London society. But Alexander Thornfield was not finished, for exposing Geoffrey's cruelty was only half of what he intended to accomplish on this night that would be remembered in London society for generations to come. With Eleanor standing before him, trembling but holding her head high with a dignity that 3 years of systematic abuse had not managed to destroy, Alexander did something that sent shockwaves through the assembled aristocracy and forever changed the course of both their lives. He turned to Eleanor, and in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast ballroom, he told her and everyone present that in the weeks of working with her on the orphanage project, he had discovered a woman of extraordinary intelligence, compassion, and strength. A woman whose value had been deliberately hidden by a man too insecure to recognize the treasure he possessed. He spoke of Eleanor's innovative ideas for reforming London's charitable institutions, of her kindness to those less fortunate, and of the grace with which she had endured years of cruelty without allowing it to make her cruel in return. Then Alexander Thornfield, Duke of Ravenscar, one of the most powerful and sought-after men in all of England, knelt before Eleanor Ashford in front of 500 witnesses and asked her to do him the honor of becoming his wife once her marriage to Geoffrey was legally dissolved. The proposal was not a quiet private affair as custom dictated, but a public declaration that Eleanor's worth was not determined by her current husband's assessment, but by her inherent qualities, and that Alexander considered marriage to her not a charitable act, but the greatest privilege he could imagine. The ballroom had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that precedes either triumph or catastrophe, as London society collectively held its breath and waited to see what Eleanor would do. Eleanor stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only seconds, her mind racing through the implications of what was happening. She understood that accepting Alexander's proposal in this moment was not simply agreeing to marry him, but was also a public rejection of Geoffrey, a declaration of her own worth, and a statement that she would no longer accept silence and diminishment as the price of survival. Every lesson Geoffrey had drilled into her over 3 years screamed at her to refuse, to apologize, to make herself small and invisible and safe. But another voice, one that sounded like her father and her younger self and Alexander all at once, whispered that safety purchased through self-erasure was not safety at all, but simply a slower form of death. And so Eleanor Ashford, who had been silent for so long that society had forgotten she could speak, found her voice and used it to accept the Duke's proposal, her words clear and steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The ballroom erupted in chaos, some guests applauding this dramatic vindication, while others whispered scandalized commentary about propriety and the unseemliness of such a public spectacle. Geoffrey Ashford, his face purple with impotent rage, began to shout that Eleanor was still legally his wife, that she had no right to accept another man's proposal, that this was an outrage against the natural order of marriage and masculine authority. But his protests were drowned out by Alexander's calm statement that the annulment proceedings were already underway, that Eleanor would be residing under the protection of his aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Waverley, until the legal matters were resolved, and that any man who attempted to interfere with Eleanor's freedom or safety would answer directly to him. Alexander rose from his knees and took Eleanor's hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and deeply intimate, and then he turned to address the assembled company one final time. He declared that in his house, in his life, and in any sphere where he held influence, Eleanor's voice would not merely be heard, but would be law, that her opinions would be sought and valued, that her intelligence and compassion would be celebrated rather than suppressed, and that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never again knew what it meant to be silenced or diminished. The declaration was both a promise to Eleanor and a challenge to London society, a statement that true nobility meant protecting and elevating those with less power, and that any social system that required women to accept systematic cruelty in exchange for respectability was a system that needed to be challenged and changed. The months that followed the grand ball became a period of transformation for Eleanor that she could never have imagined in her darkest days of marriage to Geoffrey Ashford. The annulment proceedings moved forward with remarkable speed, aided by Alexander's influence and the testimony of numerous witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak truth about what they had observed. Geoffrey attempted to fight the dissolution of his marriage, hiring lawyers and making appeals based on his rights as a husband, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and more importantly, he had made the fatal error of challenging a duke who had both the resources and the determination to see justice done. Within 6 months, Eleanor's marriage was legally dissolved, the church having ruled that Geoffrey had obtained her consent through fraud by concealing his true nature during their courtship, and that his subsequent cruelty constituted grounds for annulment rather than mere divorce. Eleanor spent those months living with the Dowager Duchess of Waverley, Alexander's formidable aunt, who became not just her protector, but her champion and friend. The Dowager, a woman who had herself survived a difficult first marriage before finding happiness as a widow, took Eleanor under her wing and helped her navigate the complex social waters that came with being publicly affiliated with the Duke of Ravenscar. Under the Dowager's guidance, Eleanor began to reclaim the parts of herself that Geoffrey had tried to destroy, rediscovering her love of reading and intellectual conversation, her passion for charitable work, and her natural warmth and humor that had been suppressed for so long. She also discovered that London society, which she had expected to condemn her for the scandal of her annulment and rapid engagement to Alexander, had instead largely rallied to her side, For the Duke's public declaration had given permission for people to finally acknowledge what many had quietly observed and to celebrate Eleanor's escape rather than condemn her for seeking freedom. The wedding of Eleanor Hartley to Alexander Thornfield, Duke of Ravenscar, took place on a golden autumn morning in the private chapel at Thornfield Palace, with only intimate friends and family in attendance. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that made her look like a Renaissance painting come to life, and when she walked down the aisle toward Alexander, there were no tears of duty or resignation in her eyes, but rather joy and hope, and the profound relief of someone who had survived a terrible ordeal and emerged into sunlight. Alexander, watching his bride approach, felt his heart expand with a love so fierce and protective that it almost frightened him, and when he took Eleanor's hand and spoke his vows, he was not just promising to honor and cherish her, but silently vowing to spend every day of their marriage proving to her that love could be partnership rather than prison, that marriage could elevate rather than diminish, and that her voice would always matter in their shared life. The years that followed their marriage were marked by a happiness that Eleanor had never believed possible, and a partnership that became legendary in London society. As the Duchess of Ravenscar, Eleanor used her position and Alexander's resources to revolutionize charitable work in London, creating systems of support for abused women, reforming orphanages, and establishing educational programs for girls from poor families. She became known not as the Duke's decorative wife, but as a force for social change in her own right, a woman whose intelligence and compassion transformed countless lives and whose story inspired other women trapped in cruel marriages to seek help and freedom. Alexander, for his part, discovered that loving Eleanor and supporting her work brought him a peace and purpose he had not known since his mother's death, and that partnership with a woman he respected and admired was infinitely more satisfying than the cold isolation he had cultivated for so many years. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, and Alexander made certain that all of them, regardless of gender, were raised to value intelligence, compassion, and the fundamental equality of all human beings. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of Eleanor and Alexander's story, but perhaps this is where your own story truly begins. For Eleanor's journey teaches us that our value is not determined by those who choose to diminish us, that silence purchased through fear is a prison we have the power to escape, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to accept cruelty as the price of survival. Her story reminds us that true strength is not found in dominance, but in the willingness to use our power to protect and elevate others, and that love, real love, creates space for both people to flourish rather than requiring one person to disappear so the other can shine. If you find yourself in a situation where your voice is being systematically silenced, where your worth is being questioned by someone who benefits from your diminishment, remember Eleanor standing in that ballroom, finding her voice after years of enforced silence. Remember that you deserve to be heard, to be valued, to take up space in the world without apology. And if you have the power and privilege that Alexander possessed, remember that nobility is measured not by title or wealth, but by what we do with our advantages, by whether we use our voice to amplify those who have been silenced, and by our willingness to challenge systems that require some people to accept less than they deserve, so that others can maintain unearned power. Eleanor's vindicating began the moment she decided that survival was not enough, that she wanted to truly live, and that transformation is available to each of us the moment we decide that our voice, our worth, and our right to be treated with dignity are not negotiable regardless of what anyone else may say. Your voice matters, your story matters, and somewhere, perhaps right now, someone needs to hear that truth so they can begin their own journey from silence to freedom, from diminishment to vindication, from merely surviving to truly, magnificently living.